I married into what I thought was a family. I was 53 years old when I overheard the words that would shatter everything I'd built over 30 years. My husband Daniel and my sister Claire thought I was napping upstairs in the home I'd inherited from my parents, the house where I'd raised my children, the place where every corner held a memory. But I wasn't sleeping. I was standing at the top of the staircase, frozen, listening to them plot my erasure. The afternoon light came through the bay window at exactly 2:47, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor my father had refinished the summer before he died. I could see them from where I stood, their heads bent together over the dining table, papers spread between them like a business transaction. Claire's blonde hair caught the sunlight, and for a moment I was transported back to our childhood, when that same hair would swing as she ran ahead of me to the park. Daniel's hand rested on those papers, his wedding ring glinting. That ring had cost us $800 30 years ago, bought on credit because we were young and broke and in love. "We'll put her in a nursing home next week," Claire said. "The house is ours." Daniel nodded, leaning closer. "She's getting worse. The forgetfulness, the confusion. Dr. Matthews will sign off on the competency evaluation." $800,000 transfers same day, Claire continued, tapping the paper. "I already have the POA documents ready. Once she's placed, we file this quitclaim deed. The house sells, we split it, and nobody questions anything." My hand tightened on the banister. The wood was cool and smooth under my palm, worn down by decades of hands sliding along its length. My mother's hands, my children's hands, mine. I thought about the apple pie I'd baked that morning, still sitting on the kitchen counter. Claire had eaten 2 slices, complimenting the cinnamon, asking for the recipe she'd asked for 100 times before. Daniel had kissed my forehead and told me it was perfect. I'd felt useful, loved. What a fool I'd been. The house had been in my family for 60 years. My parents bought it in 1963 for $32,000, a fortune to them then. They'd painted every wall, planted every tree in the backyard, built the deck where we'd hosted countless barbecues. When they died, they left it to me, not to Claire, and I'd always wondered if that decision had planted some seed of resentment in her heart. Now I knew it had grown into something monstrous. I descended the stairs slowly, deliberately, each step measured. They didn't hear me until I was standing in the doorway of the dining room, watching them. Claire looked up first, her face shifting through several expressions before settling on concern. "You're awake," she said brightly. "We were just going over some paperwork, boring adult stuff." Daniel turned, and I saw something flicker in his eyes, fear maybe, or calculation. I stepped forward and picked up the papers between them. The quitclaim deed had my forged signature already on it, a surprisingly good replica. The power of attorney document was dated 3 days ago. The nursing home brochure was for Meadowbrook Memory Care, starting at $9,000 a month. "You forgot one thing," I said quietly. They looked at each other. Claire recovered first, standing and reaching for the papers. "Mom's been getting so confused lately," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We're just trying to help, making plans for when the time comes." I held the papers out of her reach. "The time comes? I'm 53 years old. I have a master's degree in education. I taught high school English for 28 years. Last week I balanced my checkbook to the penny and beat both of you at Scrabble." Daniel stood, his face reddening. "Now let's not get upset. We're family. We're looking out for you. By stealing my house? By forging my signature? By planning to lock me away?" "You're being dramatic," Claire said, but her voice had lost its sweetness. "We're not stealing anything. We're protecting assets. You're getting older, you need care, and this house is too much for you." I walked to the sideboard and pulled out the locked drawer, the one only I had the key to. Inside was a folder I'd been maintaining for 3 weeks, ever since I'd first noticed Claire asking pointed questions about my memory, about whether I'd been forgetting things. Little tests, I'd realized later, planting seeds. I spread the contents across the table, bank statements showing the $15,000 Daniel had transferred from our joint account to an LLC registered in his name. Printed emails between Claire and a realtor discussing the sale of my property. A recorded conversation from last week where Daniel told his brother that I was losing my marbles and would be in a home by Christmas. Text messages between Claire and someone named Marcus discussing how to expedite a competency evaluation. "I've been documenting everything," I said. "Every conversation, every transaction, every lie." The room went silent. Outside, I could hear the neighbor's dog barking, the sound carrying through the walls the same way it had for 15 years. Normal sounds. Life continuing while mine fell apart. Daniel's face had gone white. Claire's mouth opened and closed. "You think I didn't notice?" I continued. "The way you kept asking if I'd taken my medicine when I don't take any medicine? The way you'd hide my car keys and then ask if I'd lost them? The appointments you made with Dr. Matthews that I knew nothing about?" I pulled out another document. This one was older, yellowed at the edges. "This is my parents' will. It states very clearly that this house is mine, in my name alone, and cannot be transferred without my explicit consent. It also has a clause that if anyone attempts to coerce or defraud me out of this property, they forfeit any claim to it or any inheritance from me." My father had been a lawyer. He'd seen too many families torn apart by greed. He'd protected me, even from beyond the grave. Claire's composure cracked. "You always got everything. The house, their attention, their pride. I was never good enough. So you decided to take it?" I walked closer to her, close enough to see the pores in her skin, the fine lines around her eyes. "You're my sister. I trusted you with my life. I let you into my home. I loved you." Past tense. The words hung in the air. Daniel finally found his voice. "We can fix this. We can talk about this. You're right, we got carried away, but we can get out." He blinked. "What?" "Get out of my house. Both of you. Now." Claire grabbed her purse, her hands shaking. "You'll regret this. You need us." "No," I said. "I needed to believe in you. I needed to trust that family meant something. But I don't need liars and thieves." They left, Daniel first, then Claire, who paused at the door as if she might say something. But what was there to say? The truth had been spoken. The masks had fallen. I stood in my dining room, surrounded by evidence of betrayal, and felt the weight of 30 years of marriage and 53 years of sisterhood slide off my shoulders. The house was quiet again. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, my hands steady. The next morning, I called my attorney at 9:15. His name was Robert Chen, and he'd handled my parents' estate. He listened without interrupting as I explained everything, sending him digital copies of all my documentation. "This is comprehensive," he said finally. "You've built a solid case. Do you want to pursue criminal charges?" I thought about it. Daniel and Claire, arrested, prosecuted. But that would mean months or years of court battles, of airing our private pain in public spaces. "Not yet," I said. "First, I want to make sure they can never do this to me or anyone else again." Robert scheduled an appointment for the following afternoon. I spent the rest of that day walking through my house, really looking at it. The wallpaper in the hallway that my mother had chosen in 1975. The height marks on the kitchen door frame where she'd measured me and Claire every birthday. The loose floorboard in the second bedroom that creaked in exactly the same way it had for 40 years. This was mine. Not because it was worth $800,000, but because it held my history, my family's story, the foundation of who I was. That evening, my daughter Sarah called. She lived 3 states away with her husband and 2 kids. We talked every Sunday, but this was Tuesday. "Dad called me," she said. "He said you had some kind of breakdown, that you accused him and Aunt Claire of horrible things." I closed my eyes. Already, the narrative was being shaped, the story being told with them as victims and me as unhinged. "Did he tell you what those horrible things were?" He was vague. "Just said you weren't yourself," I told her. "Everything. Every detail." I sent her copies of the evidence. She was silent for a long time after I finished. "I'll kill him," she said finally. "No, you won't. But you will be my witness if I need one. Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have visited more. I should have known. How could you? They were careful. They were patient. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned." We talked for another hour. She told me about a conversation she'd had with Daniel 3 months ago, where he'd casually asked about my mental state, about whether I was having any memory issues. Planting seeds, even then. building a narrative. The next afternoon, I sat in Robert's office at 2:30, the air conditioning humming softly through the vents. His office smelled like leather and old paper, a comforting smell that reminded me of my father's study. "We have several options," Robert said, spreading his own documents across his desk. "First, we secure your assets completely. I'll file paperwork today putting your house in a living trust with you as trustee. That makes it nearly impossible for anyone to claim it through POA or competency proceedings. What else? We can file for a restraining order based on the attempted fraud. We can report the forged documents to the police. We can sue for emotional distress." He paused. "Or we can do what I suspect you really want, which is to protect yourself and send a message without destroying your family permanently." I appreciated that he understood. "What does that look like?" "We draw up ironclad legal documents protecting all your assets. We have them served to Daniel and Claire with a letter explaining that any further attempt to defraud you or claim incompetence will result in immediate criminal prosecution. We make it clear that you have evidence, witnesses, and legal representation. We make the cost of continuing too high." "And my marriage?" He looked at me with something like sympathy. "That's not a legal question." "I know." I signed the paperwork that day. The living trust, a new will that explicitly disinherited anyone who attempted to coerce or defraud me, and a durable power of attorney naming Sarah as my sole agent, effective only if I was truly incapacitated and certified by 2 independent physicians. By the end of the week, Daniel and Claire had been served. Daniel came to the house at 6:42 in the evening. I watched him through the window before answering the door. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. "Can we talk?" he asked. I let him in, but only as far as the entryway. He stood with his hands in his pockets, not meeting my eyes. "I never meant for it to go that far," he said. "Claire had this idea, and it just spiraled. I was weak. I was stupid. You were willing to have me declared incompetent and locked away so you could steal my house. When you say it like that, that's what it is. There's no other way to say it." He looked up then, and I saw something calculating in his expression, something that made me realize the remorse was as fake as everything else had been. "You'll never manage alone," he said. "You think you will, but you won't. You'll come begging me to come back. Get out. I'm still your husband. I have rights. I filed for divorce this morning. You'll be served tomorrow. My attorney suggests you get your own." His face hardened. "You're making a mistake. I'll fight you on everything. The house, the savings, all of it. Try. You committed fraud. You forged documents. You conspired to have me falsely imprisoned. I have evidence that would put you in jail. The only reason you're not there now is because I'm giving you a chance to walk away quietly." He left without another word. I locked the door behind him and stood in my entryway, breathing deeply. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. The next week brought a flurry of activity. My son called, confused and angry, having heard 3 different versions of events. I sent him the evidence too, watched his faith in his father crumble through the phone. It hurt to do that to him, but the truth was the truth. Claire tried a different approach. She came to the house at 10:20 on a Thursday morning with tears in her eyes and a story about how Daniel had manipulated her, how she'd been trying to protect me from him, how it had all been a misunderstanding. "I have the emails, Claire. I have the texts. I have recordings. You can't gaslight me." She dropped the act then, her face going cold. "You're going to be alone. You realize that? Nobody will want anything to do with you after this. If people only want to be around me so they can rob me, I'd rather be alone." She left, and I haven't seen her since. But I wasn't alone. Sarah came to visit, bringing my grandchildren. My son called every other day. Friends from my teaching days reached out, having heard through the grapevine that I was going through a difficult time. I didn't tell them everything, but I told them enough. And I met with Robert again, this time not about defense, but about offense. "I want to make sure they can't do this to someone else," I told him. "Is there a way to report them? To create a record?" "We can file a complaint with Adult Protective Services," he said. Even though you weren't actually victimized, the attempt is worth documenting. We can also report the forged documents to the district attorney. They may or may not prosecute, but it creates a paper trail. Do it." He did. Within 2 weeks, I received a call from a social worker named Jennifer who wanted to meet with me. She arrived at my house at 3:15 on a rainy afternoon, her coat dripping water onto my welcome mat. The coffee I made filled the kitchen with its rich, dark scent, bitter and strong, the way my father used to make it. Jennifer wrapped her hands around the mug and listened as I walked her through everything again, showing her the evidence, the timeline, the careful premeditation of it all. "This is one of the more sophisticated cases I've seen," she said. "Usually it's more impulsive, more obvious, but this was planned over months. Can you do anything? I can open a case file. I can interview them. I can flag them in the system, so if they try this with someone else, there's a history." She paused. "And I can connect you with resources. Support groups for people who've experienced financial exploitation by family members. You'd be surprised how common this is." That was the part that broke me, finally. Not the betrayal itself, but the knowledge that it was common, that across the country, across the world, families were tearing each other apart over money, over houses, over things. I cried for the first time since this had started, sitting at my kitchen table with a stranger who understood. Jennifer didn't try to comfort me with empty words. She just sat with me until the tears stopped, until I could breathe again. Over the next few weeks, I discovered a strange new rhythm to my life. I woke when I wanted. I ate what I wanted. I didn't have to consider anyone else's schedule or needs or moods. The house felt different, lighter somehow, despite the weight of what had happened in it. I also started noticing things I'd missed. Bills that Daniel had been paying late, subscriptions I didn't know we had, a storage unit rented in both our names that I'd never been to. I went there on a Saturday morning at 11 o'clock, curious and a little afraid of what I'd find. The storage unit was small, just 10 by 10, but it was full. Furniture I recognized from my parents' house, pieces I'd thought were sold or donated after they died, my mother's jewelry box, photo albums, my father's coin collection. Daniel had been stealing from me for years, taking things he thought I wouldn't miss or wouldn't remember, stockpiling them for some future he'd been planning, some future without me. I called Robert. He documented everything, photographed every item. We added it to the growing file of evidence. The divorce proceedings, which Daniel had promised to fight, suddenly became much quieter. His attorney, seeing the evidence, advised him to settle. But the house, my house, was never on the table. That was mine, secured in trust, untouchable. One evening, about 6 weeks after I'd overheard that conversation, I sat on my back deck watching the sunset. The sky was streaked with orange and purple, the trees in my yard silhouetted against it. This view had been my mother's favorite. She'd sit out here every evening in summer, a book in her lap, just watching the day end. My phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Mrs. Patterson? This is Detective Lisa Morrison with the Financial Crimes Unit." My heart jumped. "Yes? I'm calling about the complaint filed regarding attempted fraud and forgery. We've completed our preliminary investigation, and I'd like to discuss next steps with you. We scheduled a meeting for the following Monday." I arrived at the police station at 9:30, my palms sweating despite the cool morning. Detective Morrison was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. She spread out copies of my evidence, along with additional documents I hadn't seen. "We've been investigating your sister and husband," she said. "The forgery alone is a felony. But we've also discovered that your husband has been systematically moving assets out of joint accounts for the past year. He created an LLC, as you documented, but he also opened accounts in your name without your knowledge." She slid a paper across the desk. "Does this signature look familiar?" It was my signature, or close enough to pass a casual inspection. But I hadn't signed that bank application. "He's done this before," Detective Morrison continued. "We found records of similar activity with his previous wife, different circumstances but the same pattern: financial control, isolation, and then asset stripping." Previous wife. Daniel had told me she'd died. A car accident, sudden and tragic, 10 years before we met. But that had been a lie, too. "She's alive," the detective said, reading my expression. "Living in Florida. Remarried. She filed for divorce from him after discovering he'd taken out a second mortgage on their house without her knowledge. She didn't press charges because she just wanted out. But she's willing to talk to us now." The room felt too small suddenly, the air too thin. I'd been married to a man I'd never known. 30 years of my life built on lies. "What happens now?" I asked. "We build a case. We'll need your cooperation, full access to all your evidence, and your willingness to testify if it goes to trial. Your sister is likely to take a plea deal if we offer one. Your husband is going to fight. I'll do whatever you need." She smiled, the first real warmth I'd seen from her. "You've done the hardest part already. You trusted your instincts, you documented everything, and you didn't let them convince you that you were crazy. Most victims don't make it this far." Victim. The word felt strange. I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like someone who'd been tested and had passed. Over the next month, I gave statements, signed affidavits, turned over every piece of evidence I'd collected. My phone records showing the recording of Daniel's conversation with his brother, my computer files with the screenshots of Claire's emails, the documents from the storage unit, the forged signatures, all of it. And I waited. Waiting felt like its own kind of torture. I filled the time by reconnecting with old friends, people I'd drifted away from during my marriage. I realized, with growing clarity, how much Daniel had isolated me. Not obviously, not through forbidding me to see people, but through small discouragements, through being just difficult enough that it was easier not to make plans, through monopolizing my time and energy. I also started therapy. My insurance covered 12 sessions, and I used every one. Dr. Lisa Warren's office was small and comfortable, filled with plants and soft lighting. She helped me untangle 30 years of manipulation, helped me see the patterns I'd missed. "Financial abuse doesn't look like what people think," she told me in our third session. "It's not always about taking money. Sometimes it's about control, about making you dependent, about ensuring you could never leave. But I did leave," I said. "You did. And that takes incredible strength. I didn't feel strong. I felt exhausted and angry and sad. But I showed up every week, did the work, and slowly began to feel like myself again. Or maybe not myself as I'd been, but myself as I was becoming." The call from Detective Morrison came on a Tuesday afternoon at 4:55. I was in my garden, pulling weeds from around the tomatoes I'd planted in spring. They were heavy with fruit now, red and ripe. "We've made arrests," she said. "Your husband and sister were taken into custody this morning. They'll be arraigned tomorrow. I wanted you to hear it from me first." I sat down hard on the grass, the phone pressed to my ear. "What are the charges?" "For your husband, forgery, fraud, identity theft, and attempted exploitation of an elderly person. For your sister, conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and attempted exploitation. Bail is being set now. Will they get out? Probably. But they'll be monitored, and the trial will proceed whether you're comfortable with it or not at this point. The state has enough evidence." I thanked her and hung up, sat in my garden, surrounded by the smell of earth and tomatoes and growing things. The sun was warm on my face. The house behind me stood solid and safe. I'd won. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. That night, Sarah called. She'd heard about the arrests through her father's family. "They're saying you set him up, that you manipulated everything. Let them say what they want. The evidence speaks for itself." "Are you okay?" I looked around my kitchen, at the pie cooling on the counter, at the comfortable disorder of a life being rebuilt. "I'm getting there." The arraignment was the next day. I didn't attend, but Robert did, and he called me afterward with the details. Daniel had pleaded not guilty. Claire had cried and claimed coercion. Bail was set at $50,000 for Daniel, $25,000 for Claire. They'd both posted it within hours. "Now we wait for trial," Robert said. "Could be 6 months, could be a year. Are you prepared for that? Do I have a choice? You always have a choice. You could ask the prosecutor to offer a plea deal. You could drop your cooperation. You could let this go." "No," I said. "I can't. Because the truth was, this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Daniel's first wife, who he'd told me was dead. It was about the next person he might target if he wasn't stopped. It was about every family member who'd been gaslit and stolen from and told they were losing their minds. Over the following weeks, the reality of a criminal case set in. Reporters called, having seen the public records. My name showed up in local news articles, though they were careful to identify me only as the alleged victim. Friends I hadn't heard from in years reached out, some with support, some with ghoulish curiosity. And my extended family took sides. Daniel's brother called me vindictive. Claire's daughter, my niece, sent me a long email about how I was tearing the family apart. Cousins I'd been close to suddenly stopped answering my calls. But others rallied around me. My children, unequivocally. My old teaching colleagues. My neighbor, who testified that she'd seen Claire and Daniel meeting at my house on multiple occasions when I wasn't home, letting themselves in with keys I didn't know they had. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for December 15th. I marked it on my calendar and tried not to count the days. Instead, I focused on living. I took a watercolor class at the community center. I volunteered at the library. I had my grandchildren visit for a week, filling the house with noise and joy and sticky fingerprints. And one afternoon, about 4 months after I'd overheard those words that changed everything, I was contacted by a woman named Patricia. She'd read about my case in the news. She was Daniel's first wife, the one who hadn't died. We met at a coffee shop at 2 o'clock on a Thursday. She was elegant, composed, with gray streaks in her dark hair and eyes that held too much experience. "He told you I was dead?" she asked, and I heard the echo of her own betrayals in that question. "Car accident. Very tragic. I'm sorry." She laughed, bitter and short. "He used to tell people I was mentally ill, that I couldn't be trusted, that I was paranoid and delusional." She leaned forward. "But I documented everything too. And when I saw your case, I knew I had to reach out, because you're not going to believe what they'll try during the trial. Tell me." She spent the next 2 hours walking me through her own experience with Daniel, the gaslighting, the financial manipulation, the way he'd turned their friends against her, the fake medical reports he'd created to support his claims about her mental health, the attorney who'd almost believed him until she produced her own evidence. "He's good," Patricia said. "He's very, very good at playing the victim, at making people believe his version of events. You need to be prepared for that." "I am." She looked at me with something like pity. "You think you are. But when you're sitting in that courtroom and he's crying, telling some story about how he was only trying to help you, how he was scared and confused, how you're misunderstanding everything, it's going to shake you. Even knowing it's a lie, it's going to shake you." She was right. When the preliminary hearing finally came, Daniel's performance was Oscar-worthy. He'd lost weight. His eyes were red-rimmed. He spoke in a soft, broken voice about how he'd only been trying to protect me, how he'd been frightened by my forgetfulness, how he'd never meant any harm. If I hadn't had evidence, if I hadn't known the truth with absolute certainty, I might have believed him. The judge looked sympathetic. Daniel's attorney painted a picture of a devoted husband driven to desperate measures by fear and love. But then the prosecutor presented the evidence piece by piece, building an unassailable timeline of premeditation and fraud. The prosecutor's voice cut through the courtroom at 10:35, sharp and clear as a bell. The evidence shows systematic premeditation. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't confusion. This was a calculated plan to defraud Mrs. Patterson of her home and her freedom. I sat in the gallery, my hands folded in my lap, watching Daniel's shoulders shake with what looked like sobs. His attorney handed him a tissue. The judge's expression remained neutral, but I saw her eyes flick to the documents in front of her, to the timeline of forged signatures and secret bank accounts. The hearing lasted 3 hours. By the end, the judge ruled there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Trial date was set for March 3rd, 4 months away. Daniel and Claire would remain free on bail, but with conditions. No contact with me, no access to any of my properties or accounts, no attempts to sell or transfer any disputed assets. As I left the courthouse, a reporter stopped me on the steps. Mrs. Patterson, how do you feel about the judge's decision? I feel like the truth is being heard. That clip played on the local news that night. My phone rang constantly. I stopped answering. But one call I did take at 7:15 that evening was from a woman named Helen. "You don't know me," she said, "but I saw your case in the news. My son did something similar to me 5 years ago. I didn't fight it. I let him put me in a home, let him sell my house. I've regretted it every day since." She paused, and I heard her breath catch. "Thank you for fighting. Thank you for showing it can be done." We talked for 20 minutes. She told me about the home she'd lost, the independence she'd surrendered, the grandchildren who'd been turned against her by lies. By the end, we were both crying, but her tears sounded different than mine. Mine were anger and grief. Hers were something like hope. I started getting more calls like that. Letters, too. Women mostly, but some men. People who'd been financially abused by family members, who'd been gaslit and manipulated and told they were incompetent. People who'd lost everything, and people who'd barely escaped. They all said the same thing. Thank you for fighting. I hadn't realized, until then, that my story was bigger than just me. The months before trial were strange. I lived my life, but always with this weight hanging over me, this knowledge that in March I would have to stand in front of strangers and detail every humiliation, every betrayal. My therapist helped me prepare, running through likely questions, helping me stay grounded in facts rather than emotions. "You're going to want to defend yourself against their narrative," Dr. Warren said. "You're going to want to explain and justify, but the evidence speaks for itself. Your job is just to tell the truth clearly and calmly. What if I can't?" Then you take a breath and try again. You've already done the hardest part. You've already survived. I spent Christmas alone, by choice. Sarah offered to come, but I needed the quiet. I needed to sit in my house and remember why I was doing this. I baked cookies using my mother's recipe, the kitchen filling with the smell of cinnamon and vanilla, sweet and warm and comforting. I hung lights on the tree my father had planted 40 years ago. I watched old movies and slept in and didn't have to consider anyone else's needs. It was the best Christmas I'd had in years. January brought depositions. I sat across a conference table from Daniel's attorney, a sharp woman named Margaret, who asked the same questions 15 different ways, looking for contradictions. But I'd lived this story. I knew it inside and out. There were no contradictions to find. She tried a different approach. "Isn't it true that you and your husband had discussed downsizing?" "Yes, in general terms, as something we might consider in 10 or 15 years. And isn't it true that you had forgotten several appointments last year?" "I missed one dentist appointment because I wrote down the wrong date. That's hardly evidence of incompetence." "But you did forget?" "I made a scheduling error. I also published 2 articles in education journals last year and served on the school board. People who are incompetent don't do those things." She moved on, trying to paint me as unreliable, as dramatic, as vindictive. But every time she made an assertion, I had evidence to counter it. Bank records, emails, testimony from friends and colleagues. The truth, it turned out, was an excellent defense. Claire's deposition was different. She cried through most of it, claiming she'd been manipulated by Daniel, that she'd been trying to protect me, that everything had been misunderstood. Her attorney was clearly frustrated, trying to get her to stick to a consistent story. But I had her emails. I had her text messages to the realtor. I had her voice on a recording discussing how to expedite the competency evaluation. No amount of tears could erase that. February came, and with it, jury selection. I sat in the courtroom day after day, watching strangers be questioned about their ability to be fair, about their experiences with family dynamics, about their understanding of financial abuse. The prosecutor, a man named James Bradford, was methodical and thorough. He wanted people who understood that abuse didn't always look violent, that family could be dangerous. The defense wanted people who believed in giving second chances, who thought the elderly were unreliable, who valued family loyalty above all else. It was fascinating and horrible to watch, this sorting of people into camps, this measurement of their biases and beliefs. The final jury was seated on February 26th, 12 people who would decide whether Daniel and Claire had committed crimes or just made mistakes, 12 strangers who held my vindication in their hands. The trial started on March 3rd at 9 o'clock sharp. The courtroom was packed. My children sat behind me. Daniel's family sat behind him. Claire sat at a separate defense table, her attorney having successfully argued for a severance. She would be tried separately, but after Daniel's trial concluded, the judge, a woman named Catherine Brennan, called the court to order. Her voice was firm, authoritative. She laid out the charges, the process, the expectations. Then James stood to give his opening statement. The texture of the prosecutor's folder was visible from where I sat, the leather worn smooth from years of use, the edges soft with handling. He held it as he spoke, occasionally glancing down at his notes, but mostly maintaining eye contact with the jury. "This case is about trust and betrayal," he said. "About a husband who spent 30 years building trust with his wife, only to plan her destruction. About a sister who knew her siblings' deepest vulnerabilities and weaponized them. This is about greed disguised as care." He walked them through the timeline: the creation of the LLC, the secret bank accounts, the forged signatures, the fake competency concerns, the nursing home brochures, the quit claim deed already signed in my name by someone who wasn't me. Mrs. Patterson is here today, not because she was saved by chance, but because she saved herself, because she noticed, because she documented, because she refused to believe the lie that she was losing her mind. Margaret's opening statement was smooth and compassionate. She painted Daniel as a frightened husband watching his wife decline, making poor choices out of love and fear. She acknowledged the mistakes, but framed them as desperate acts by a desperate man. "Ask yourselves," she said to the jury, "have you ever been so scared for someone you love that you did something you later regretted? Have you ever tried to help in a way that went wrong?" It was a good strategy, but it required the jury to ignore the evidence, to believe that love could look like theft. The prosecution's case took 2 weeks. Witnesses testified about the forged documents, the bank manager who'd noticed suspicious activity on my accounts, the realtor who'd been contacted by Claire about selling my house, the nursing home administrator who'd received a deposit for a room I'd never agreed to. Patricia, Daniel's first wife, testified about the pattern of behavior she'd experienced, the gaslighting, the financial manipulation, the way he'd tried to have her declared incompetent, too. Margaret objected repeatedly, arguing relevance, but the judge allowed most of it. "Pattern evidence," she ruled, "demonstrates intent and methodology." And then I testified. James had prepared me, but nothing could really prepare you for sitting in that witness box, swearing to tell the truth and having your life dissected in public. He walked me through the events chronologically. The first time I'd noticed Claire asking odd questions, the hidden documents I'd found, the conversation I'd overheard at 2:47 on that afternoon that changed everything. And what did you do when you heard your husband and sister planning to institutionalize you? I documented everything. I contacted an attorney, I protected my assets, I fought back. Margaret's cross-examination was aggressive. She asked about every time I'd forgotten something, every appointment I'd missed, every moment of confusion. She tried to suggest that maybe Daniel had been right to be concerned, that maybe I was less competent than I believed. But I was ready. For every example she gave, I had context. Yes, I'd missed that dentist appointment, but I'd remembered the 43 other appointments that year. Yes, I'd sometimes forgot where I'd put my keys, but so did everyone. Yes, I'd occasionally repeated stories, but I could also recite the complete works of Shakespeare from memory, a skill I'd maintained since my teaching days. Your husband says he was trying to protect you. Is that possible? No. How can you be so certain? Because protection doesn't involve forgery. It doesn't involve stealing. It doesn't involve planning to lock someone away against their will. He wasn't protecting me. He was eliminating me. The courtroom was silent. I saw 2 jurors nodding slightly. The defense case was shorter. Daniel testified, of course. He cried. He apologized. He claimed everything had spiraled out of control, that he'd never meant to hurt me, that he'd just been so frightened by my decline. But on cross-examination, James was brutal. He walked Daniel through every lie, every forged signature, every secret transfer. He showed the jury the timeline, the careful planning, the patience of it all. If you were so concerned about your wife's competence, why didn't you discuss it with her directly? I tried. She wouldn't listen. James pulled out my medical records, obtained through subpoena. She had a complete physical and cognitive evaluation 6 months before you started this scheme. Her doctor found no signs of cognitive decline. Did you know that? Daniel hesitated. I must have misunderstood what I was seeing. Or you saw what you wanted to see because it justified what you wanted to do. Objection. Sustained. Rephrase, Mr. Bradford. Did you want your wife's house? A long pause. Finally, I thought it might be necessary to sell it eventually. To split the proceeds with her sister? For care. For her care. But you'd already calculated the split, 50-50. According to the texts, not for care, for profit. Daniel didn't answer. The jury watched him, their faces unreadable. The smoking gun came on day 16. James had saved it, built to it, created anticipation. He introduced a document I hadn't even known existed, a life insurance policy on me, taken out by Daniel 3 years ago, with him as the sole beneficiary. $250,000. Did your wife know about this policy? James asked. Daniel's attorney had clearly not known about it either. Her face went pale. Daniel stammered, I meant to tell her. But you didn't. You took out a life insurance policy on your wife without her knowledge. The same wife you were planning to institutionalize. The same wife whose house you were planning to steal. And if something happened to her while she was in that nursing home, alone and isolated, you would have received $250,000. The courtroom erupted. Judge Brennan called for order. Daniel's attorney requested a recess, granted grudgingly. When we returned, Daniel looked broken, but in a different way. Not contrite, cornered. Closing arguments came on March 24th at 2:15 in the afternoon. James spoke for 90 minutes, weaving together every piece of evidence into a comprehensive narrative of calculated betrayal. Margaret spoke for an hour, asking for mercy, for understanding, for the benefit of the doubt. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I spent that time in a strange limbo, unable to focus on anything, jumping every time my phone rang. Sarah stayed with me, cooking meals I didn't eat, keeping me company in the silence. The call came at 11:45 on March 26th. Verdict reached. We rushed to the courthouse, finding our seats as the jury filed in. Their faces were serious, unreadable. The forewoman stood. The temperature seemed to drop, a chill settling over the courtroom despite the heating running full blast. On the count of forgery in the first degree, how do you find? Guilty. On the count of fraud in the first degree, how do you find? Guilty. On the count of identity theft, how do you find? Guilty. On the count of attempted exploitation of an elderly person, how do you find? Guilty. 4 counts. 4 guilty verdicts. Daniel's face went white. His attorney put a hand on his shoulder. Behind me, I heard Sarah sob with relief. Judge Brennan thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing for April 15th. Daniel was remanded into custody immediately, bail revoked. I watched as they led him away in handcuffs. This man I'd spent 30 years with, this stranger I'd never really known. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. James Bradford stood with me, making a brief statement. Justice has been served. Mrs. Patterson's courage in coming forward has not only protected her, but potentially saved others from similar schemes. Someone asked how I felt. I looked at the cameras, at the crowd, at the bright spring sky overhead. I feel like I can breathe again. That clip went viral. Within days, I was getting interview requests from national news outlets, podcasts, advocacy organizations. I declined most of them, but I did agree to speak with a nonprofit that focused on elder financial abuse. They asked if I'd be willing to share my story at their annual conference. I thought about Helen, who'd called me after the preliminary hearing. About Patricia, who'd driven 3 hours to testify. About all the letters I'd received from people who hadn't fought, who'd lost everything, who wished they'd known they could resist. Yes, I said, I'll speak. Claire's trial came in June. With Daniel already convicted, her defense crumbled. She took a plea deal, admitting to conspiracy and attempted fraud in exchange for a lighter sentence. She showed no remorse, even at her sentencing, just anger that her plan had failed, that I'd been clever enough to catch them. Sentencing for both of them came on the same day, June 22nd at 9:30. Judge Brennan was thorough and fierce. Mr. Patterson, you betrayed every vow you made to your wife. You exploited her trust, forged her identity, and attempted to steal her home and freedom. Your previous pattern of similar behavior demonstrates that this was not an aberration, but a methodology. I sentence you to 8 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for 4 years. Additionally, you will pay restitution of $75,000 to cover Mrs. Patterson's legal expenses and therapeutic costs. She turned to Claire. Ms. Thompson, as Mrs. Patterson's sister, your betrayal cuts even deeper. Family is meant to be a source of safety and support. You weaponized that relationship for financial gain. I sentence you to 3 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation. You will also pay restitution of $35,000. Neither of them looked at me as they were led away. I wondered if they ever would, if they would ever understand what they'd done. But that wasn't my burden to carry anymore. The community reckoning came in unexpected ways. My church, where I'd been a member for 20 years, held a special service acknowledging what I'd endured. Pastor Michael spoke about betrayal and resilience, about the courage it takes to stand up to family. Afterward, dozens of people came to me, sharing their own stories, thanking me for being visible in my struggle. My neighborhood threw a small gathering at the community center, a celebration of sorts. My neighbor who testified brought her famous lasagna. The couple across the street brought wine. We ate and talked and laughed, and it felt like being welcomed back from a long journey. Most surprisingly, my old school organized an assembly. They invited me to speak to the students about recognizing abuse, about trusting your instincts, about the importance of documentation and advocacy. Standing in front of those teenagers, seeing their faces light up with understanding and determination, I felt something shift inside me. This was my purpose now, not teaching English literature, but teaching survival. The conference for the Elder Abuse Nonprofit was in August, held in a hotel ballroom with 300 attendees. I was terrified standing backstage, my notes shaking in my hands. But when I walked out and saw those faces, all those people who worked in this field, who fought these battles every day, I found my voice. I told my story from beginning to end, the warmth, the betrayal, the investigation, the trial. I told them about the evidence I'd gathered, the resources I'd used, the people who'd helped me, and I told them about the moments I'd almost given up, almost believed the lie that I was losing my mind. Trust your instincts, I said. Document everything. Reach out. You are not alone, and you are not crazy. If something feels wrong, it probably is. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Afterward, people lined up to talk to me, to share their stories, to ask for advice. I stayed until the last person had spoken, until every question had been answered. This, I realized, was healing, not just for them, but for me. Life settled into a new rhythm over the following months. I continued with therapy, processing the layers of betrayal and loss. I joined a support group for survivors of financial abuse, finding community with people who understood in ways others couldn't. I also started dating, tentatively. A man named Richard, a widower I met at the library. We went slowly, carefully. I was upfront about my history, about the trial, about the scars I carried. He listened without judgment, shared his own story of loss and rebuilding. "We're not in a hurry," he said after our 3rd date. "We've got time to figure out if this works." That patience was a gift I hadn't known I needed. Sarah and her family visited often, filling my house with the chaos of grandchildren. My son called weekly, having processed his anger at his father and found peace with supporting me. I rebuilt relationships with friends I'd lost touch with, hosted dinner parties, traveled to places I'd always wanted to see. The house remained mine, secured in trust, untouchable. But it felt different now. Not like a prize I'd won or a battle I'd fought, but simply like home, the place where I belonged. 1 year after the trial, I received a letter from Patricia. She'd remarried, sold her own house, moved to a different state. But she wanted me to know that watching my case had given her closure, had validated her own experience, had helped her heal. "You showed me that fighting back is possible," she wrote, "that the truth can win. Thank you for that." I framed that letter and hung it in my study, along with photos from my teaching career, my children's graduation pictures, and a copy of the newspaper headline from the trial verdict. Reminders of who I was, what I'd survived, what I'd built. The restitution payments came, sporadically small amounts deducted from Daniel's prison wages and Claire's post-release earnings. I didn't need the money, so I donated it to the elder abuse nonprofit, funding their legal assistance program. My betrayal could help protect someone else. That felt right. I also wrote, at first just journaling, processing my experience, but then I started crafting it into something more structured, more educational. A guide for people who suspected financial abuse, who needed to document evidence, who were preparing to fight back. The nonprofit published it as a resource on their website. Within months, it had been downloaded over 10,000 times. People sent me emails, thanking me, telling me how the guide had helped them. A daughter who'd discovered her stepfather was stealing from her mother. A son who'd caught his brother forging checks. An elderly man whose caretaker was draining his accounts. All of them documented, sought legal help, and fought back. All of them won. This was legacy. This was meaning. 2 years after the trial, I attended Daniel's parole hearing. He'd served his minimum 4 years with good behavior, and he was petitioning for early release. I had the right to speak, to present a victim impact statement. I'd debated whether to go at all, whether I wanted to see him again, but I went. Because my voice mattered, and I wanted it heard. The hearing room at 3:15 that afternoon was small and institutional, nothing like the dramatic courtroom of the trial. Daniel sat at a table with his attorney, wearing prison clothes, looking older and grayer, but still recognizably himself. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and faced him directly. 4 years ago, you tried to erase me. You forged my signature, stole my money, and planned to lock me away so you could take everything I had. You didn't do this impulsively. You didn't do this out of love or fear. You did it because you wanted my assets, and you thought I was weak enough to destroy. I paused, letting the words sink in. But I wasn't weak. I was strong enough to notice, smart enough to document, and brave enough to fight back. And because of that, I still have my home, my freedom, and my life. You have none of those things, and that's justice. I looked at the parole board members. He will do this again if released. He did it to his first wife. He did it to me. He has shown no genuine remorse, only regret that he was caught. I strongly urge you to deny this petition. I sat down. Daniel didn't look at me. His attorney gave a brief statement about rehabilitation and changed behavior, but it sounded hollow. The board deliberated for 20 minutes before returning with their decision. Parole denied. Daniel would serve his full 8 years. I left that hearing room feeling lighter than I'd felt in years, not because Daniel was still in prison, but because I'd spoken my truth, and it had been heard. That was power. That was victory. Claire was released after serving her full 3 years, minus time for good behavior. She moved to a different state, changed her name, tried to start over. I heard about it through family gossip, but felt nothing. She was a chapter I'd closed, a wound that had scarred over. I had no interest in reopening it. Life continued. Seasons changed. I celebrated my 60th birthday with a party that filled my house with friends, family, and laughter. Richard was there, a steady presence in my life now. We'd been together for 3 years, taking it slow, building something real. At the party, my grandson gave a toast. To Grandma, he said, raising his juice box while the adults raised wine glasses. The strongest person I know. Everyone drank, and I felt the warmth of being seen, being valued, being loved for who I actually was, rather than who someone wanted me to be. That night, after everyone had left, I sat on my back deck watching the stars emerge. The same deck where my mother used to sit. The same yard where I'd played as a child. The same house that had nearly been stolen from me. Richard came out and sat beside me, handing me a cup of tea that tasted like honey and chamomile, sweet and soothing. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm good, really good. You've come a long way." I looked at him, this kind man who'd been patient with my healing, who'd never tried to rush me or change me. "We both have." He took my hand. "To new beginnings?" "To new beginnings." The stars above us shone bright and clear, the air crisp with autumn's approach. Inside, my house stood solid and safe, filled with memories both painful and joyful. This was my life, mine, built by my choices, protected by my courage, shaped by my resilience. I'd lost a husband and a sister, but I'd gained myself. Years from now, when I'm old enough to actually need care, when my body fails and my mind perhaps does dim, my children will make those decisions with love and respect. They'll honor my wishes because they've seen what I'll fight for, what I'll fight against. They know I'm not someone who can be erased or dismissed, and if someday this house passes to them, they'll know its value isn't in the $800,000 it might fetch on the market. It's in the generations of love it holds, the battles fought within its walls, the proof that family is about more than blood. It's about loyalty and truth, and standing up when standing up costs you everything. I've told my story dozens of times now, at conferences and support groups and to journalists and to anyone who asks. And every time, I end the same way. Trust yourself. Document everything. Fight back. You are stronger than they think you are. You are more capable than they've told you, and you deserve to be believed. Some people cry when I say that. Some people nod fiercely. Some people come up afterward and tell me they needed to hear it, that they're going to act, that they're going to protect themselves, and that's when I know the betrayal I survived wasn't just about me. It was about showing others what's possible. It was about being visible in the fight so others know they're not alone. I am 59 years old now, approaching 60. I live in the house my parents left me, the house I fought for, the house that will always be mine. I have a partner who respects me, children who support me, grandchildren who adore me, and a community that values me. I also have a voice that reaches people I've never met, helping them survive betrayals they never expected. That's purpose. That's meaning. That's life after survival. Sometimes I think about that afternoon at 2:47 when I stood at the top of my stairs and heard my world crumble. If I could go back and tell that version of myself anything, I'd say this: you will survive this. You will fight. You will win. And you will build something beautiful from the ashes, because that's what I did. That's who I became. Not a victim, not a survivor even, but someone who took her pain and transformed it into power. The house behind me is quiet now, filled with the comfortable sounds of settling walls and distant wind chimes. Richard is reading in the living room. Tomorrow, I'll meet with a new advocacy group that wants to use my story for training materials. Next month, I'm speaking at a state legislative hearing about strengthening protections against financial elder abuse. My calendar is full. My purpose is clear. My life is mine. I stood in my house, listening to the plans for my erasure, thinking this was a family I belonged to. But I built a family that actually belongs to me, one that chose to stand by me, one that proved family isn't about blood, but about loyalty and love and truth. That's the real victory. That's what they could never take away. Did you enjoy this story? Tell me which city you're listening from. I read every comment. If the story touched you, you can support the channel with a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this every day. Your encouragement really helps. I'd love to hear your thoughts and what moments stayed with you. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's plenty more on the channel as well. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. See you in the next life story. With respect and gratitude,